They thought you were surrounded. That's the funny part. A crowd can make a person feel powerful, especially when everyone is repeating the same story, the same accusation, the same fear. They believed numbers were enough. They believed if enough people stood against you, you'd eventually collapse under the pressure. But they misunderstood something very simple. A person doesn't need an army when they have stopped being afraid of the crowd. They watched you struggle and assumed you were losing. They saw the pressure, the isolation, the whispers, and the constant attempts to break your confidence. They celebrated every difficult moment because they thought resistance meant defeat. They never understood that sometimes the hardest season is simply the place where you discover how strong you actually are. You didn't defeat them by becoming cruel. You defeated their influence by refusing to let their behavior control your mind. You stopped reacting to every accusation. You stopped chasing explanations from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped giving your energy to every voice demanding your attention. And suddenly, the entire game became boring because manipulation only works when you keep playing. That's when the crowd gets nervous. Not because you've threatened anyone. Not because you've become dangerous in some dramatic fantasy. They're nervous because they can no longer predict your reactions. The person they expected to intimidate is standing calmly, thinking clearly, and moving forward without asking the crowd for permission. People who rely on fear hate clarity. Fear needs confusion. It needs you doubting yourself, questioning every decision, wondering whether you're alone. But once you recognize the difference between genuine criticism and deliberate manipulation, the spell breaks. You realize you don't need to defeat every person who stands against you. You only need to stop allowing their opinions to become the instructions for your life. And when you finally understand that, the crowd doesn't disappear. You simply stop carrying it on your back. They thought numbers were power. That's one of the oldest mistakes people make. Put enough people in one room, repeat the same accusation enough times, and suddenly everyone starts believing the crowd must be right. That's how intimidation works. It doesn't need truth. It only needs volume. It makes you question yourself because everyone around you appears certain, and certainty can look terrifying when you're standing alone. They watched you from the outside and assumed isolation meant weakness. They saw people turning against you, conversations happening without you, rumors moving faster than facts. And they thought the pressure would eventually make you surrender. They counted bodies instead of character. They measured noise instead of courage. They believed a crowd automatically becomes powerful simply because it is large. But here's the uncomfortable truth. 100 people can be wrong at the same time. 1,000 voices repeating the same story don't transform a lie into reality. Numbers create pressure, but they don't automatically create truth. The moment you understand that, intimidation starts losing its magic. You stop trying to convince everyone. That was the first crack in their strategy. They expected endless explanations. They expected you to chase every rumor, answer every accusation, defend every decision, and exhaust yourself trying to control what other people thought. Instead, you became selective. You learned that not every voice deserves a response, and not every accusation deserves a courtroom inside your mind. That's when they started becoming uncomfortable, because the person they expected to overwhelm was no longer measuring strength by the size of the opposition. You weren't trying to become louder than them. You were becoming steadier than them. There's a huge difference. Loud people need an audience. Strong people need direction. The crowd can surround you physically, emotionally, socially, or psychologically. But none of that matters if you've learned how to stand inside your own convictions. You don't need everyone to understand you before you move forward. You don't need unanimous approval before you make a decision. You don't need permission from people who have already decided to misunderstand you. And that's where the illusion collapses. They thought they were fighting a weak individual surrounded by a powerful group. They didn't realize they were watching someone who had stopped surrendering their identity to the opinions of the group. Once you stop letting other people's reactions determine your worth, their greatest weapon becomes useless. The people who relied on intimidation begin searching for another strategy. They try louder criticism, then softer manipulation, then guilt, then exclusion. They keep changing tactics because the original one stopped working. Nothing is more frustrating to someone who wants control than discovering the person they targeted has become emotionally independent. You don't defeat opposition by becoming obsessed with defeating every opponent. You defeat its influence by refusing to let it dictate your behavior. You keep your judgment clear. You protect your boundaries. You stay grounded in reality. You let actions speak louder than rumors and consistency speak louder than temporary noise, until the crowd that once looked enormous becomes nothing more than background noise behind the person who finally learned that standing alone doesn't mean standing powerless, and numbers never mattered as much as the strength to remain yourself when everyone else wanted you to become someone easier to control. Here's Keynote 2 expanded in the same dark, intense, psychologically sharp tone. Without a heading or concluding sentence, pressure has a strange personality. It doesn't introduce itself politely. It arrives when you're already exhausted, when your patience is running low, when everyone seems to have an opinion about what you should do next. And that's exactly when people discover who they really are. Some collapse. Some blame everyone around them. Some become desperate for rescue. And then there are those who become quieter, sharper, and far more difficult to break. They thought pressure would expose your weakness. They didn't realize it would expose their mistake. Every attack became another test. Every insult became another opportunity to control your emotions. Every attempt to isolate you was supposed to convince you that you were alone and therefore powerless. But isolation can teach you something crowds never will. It teaches you how to hear your own thoughts when everyone else's voice has disappeared. At first, being alone feels terrifying. You start wondering whether the crowd knows something you don't. Maybe they're right. Maybe you really aren't capable. Maybe you've misunderstood everything. That's how pressure gets inside your head. It doesn't need to destroy you physically. It only needs to make you doubt yourself enough that you destroy your own confidence. But you kept going. You started noticing something. Every time they pushed harder, you adapted. Every time circumstances became more difficult, you found another way forward. Every time someone walked away, you discovered that your life didn't end with their departure. The version of you that once needed constant reassurance slowly disappeared. That's when pressure stopped being your enemy and became your training ground. You learned how to think before reacting. You learned that anger can make you predictable. You learned that desperation makes people easy to manipulate. You learned that when everyone expects an emotional explosion, calmness becomes a form of control. Not control over other people, but control over yourself. And that's the part they never anticipated. They wanted to see you panic. They wanted proof that their attacks were working. They wanted you explaining yourself for hours, defending every accusation, chasing every person who decided to turn against you. Instead, you became selective with your energy. You stopped answering every noise. You stopped treating every disagreement like a war. The pressure didn't make you fearless. It made you familiar with fear. There's a difference. Fear can still knock on the door, but now you recognize the voice. You know what panic sounds like. You know what self-doubt feels like. You've experienced the moment when everything inside you screams to quit, and you've also learned that feelings aren't commands. They can be present without becoming your decisions. That's what real strength looks like. Not pretending nothing hurts. Not pretending you're invincible. It's being hurt and still thinking clearly. It's being surrounded by opposition and refusing to let the opposition become your identity. It's losing people and refusing to lose yourself with them. The same pressure that was supposed to destroy you became evidence of your growth. The harder they pushed, the more clearly you saw what you were capable of carrying. And eventually the people watching from the outside had to confront the one thing they never expected to see. The pressure wasn't creating your strength anymore. It was revealing the strength that had been building inside you all along. Manipulation becomes powerful when you keep feeding it. Give someone your anger, and they learn which button to press. Give them your fear, and they learn what you will run from. Give them endless explanations, and they learn that all they have to do is accuse you again. It's almost too simple. They don't need to control your entire life. They only need to control your reactions. That's how the trap works. They provoke you, you react. They twist your reaction, you defend yourself. They ignore your explanation, you explain again. Then they create another accusation, and suddenly you're spending hours, days, sometimes years trying to prove something to people who were never interested in understanding you. And while you're busy defending yourself, they're controlling the conversation. Funny, isn't it? The person causing the chaos gets to sit back and watch you exhaust yourself trying to clean it up. But eventually you notice the pattern. You stop answering immediately. You breathe, you think. You ask yourself whether this situation actually deserves your energy, or whether someone is simply trying to drag you into another emotional performance. That pause changes everything because manipulation depends on speed. It needs you angry before you can think. It needs you frightened before you can question the story. It needs you desperate before you can walk away. Once you slow down, the illusion starts falling apart. You begin seeing the difference between genuine criticism and deliberate provocation. Genuine criticism can survive a calm conversation. Manipulation usually cannot. It needs exaggeration, guilt, threats, confusion, or endless emotional pressure to maintain control. And suddenly you become difficult to manipulate, not because you became cruel, because you became observant. You stop explaining boundaries to people committed to crossing them. You stop chasing people who repeatedly disappear just to make you panic. You stop allowing someone's anger to become your emergency. Their emotions belong to them. Their choices belong to them. Their opinions belong to them. Your responsibility is what you choose to do with your own mind. That's a terrifying concept for anyone who benefited from controlling your attention. They might try harder at first. They may increase the pressure because the old tactics aren't producing the same reaction. More accusations, more rumors, more emotional games, more attempts to make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. They may even accuse you of becoming cold, when what actually happened is that you became harder to manipulate. There's a difference between becoming heartless and becoming disciplined. A disciplined person can still care deeply without allowing everyone access to their emotions. They can forgive without reopening the same door. They can listen without obeying. They can remain compassionate without becoming available for repeated disrespect. That's where your power returns, not when everyone agrees with you, not when the crowd apologizes, not when the people who hurt you finally understand what they did. Your power returns when their behavior stops deciding your behavior. They can speak. You don't have to answer, they can provoke. You don't have to perform, they can misunderstand. You don't have to chase them, they can create noise. You can keep moving. And the moment they realize they can no longer pull you into every argument, every accusation, every emotional trap, they are forced to face the most frustrating reality of all. The person they once controlled through reaction has learned to control the only thing that truly matters, the space between what happens and what you choose to do next, where their influence used to live, but no longer belongs to them. Being impossible to intimidate doesn't mean you never feel fear. That's the fantasy people sell. Real strength is much uglier and much more useful. You feel the fear, you recognize it, and you refuse to let it make your decisions. Anyone can look fearless when nothing is at stake. The real test begins when pressure is standing directly in front of you, waiting for you to blink. People who rely on intimidation need you to believe they have power over you. They want you to imagine consequences before they've even happened. They want you worried about what they might say, what they might do, who they might influence, and how many people might turn against you. Fear works best when your imagination becomes their weapon. That's why clarity matters. When you know who you are, intimidation loses half its power before the other person even speaks. You don't need to prove yourself every 5 minutes because your identity isn't being negotiated in every conversation. You can listen without surrendering. You can disagree without exploding. You can walk away without feeling like you've lost. That's a kind of strength most people don't understand. They expect confidence to be loud. They expect someone powerful to dominate the room. But sometimes the strongest person is the one sitting quietly, watching everything, refusing to be dragged into unnecessary conflict. Not because they're scared, but because they know exactly where their energy belongs. You become difficult to intimidate when you stop treating every threat as a command. Someone raises their voice. You don't automatically raise yours. Someone insults you. You don't immediately insult them back. Someone tries to embarrass you. You don't hand them your emotional control. Someone threatens to leave. You don't beg them to stay. Someone tries to make you feel guilty for having boundaries. You don't abandon those boundaries just to make them comfortable. That's when people discover they have lost access to the version of you they used to control. They may become confused. They may call you arrogant. They may say you've changed. Of course you've changed. That's what growth looks like from the perspective of someone who benefited from your old behavior. But becoming harder to intimidate doesn't mean becoming reckless. It means becoming intelligent about your responses. You don't walk toward every conflict just because you know you can fight. You learn which battles deserve your attention and which ones are simply traps designed to steal your peace. There is tremendous power in refusing unnecessary chaos. Your boundaries become clearer. Your decisions become slower and more deliberate. Your emotions become information instead of instructions. Fear becomes something you can observe rather than something you automatically obey. And eventually you reach a strange place where intimidation becomes almost boring. The same tactics that once made your heart race now look predictable. The raised voice, the guilt, the silent treatment, the threats, the pressure, the crowd gathering around you. None of it has the same effect because you understand what they're trying to accomplish. They aren't controlling you unless you participate. And once you've learned that, you can stand in a room full of people who want to see you shrink and still remain exactly where you are. Calm enough to think, disciplined enough to choose your response, and secure enough in yourself that their attempts to frighten you become nothing more than noise passing around. Someone who has finally decided that fear may speak whenever it wants, but it no longer gets to make the decisions. There is a difference between standing alone and being abandoned. People confuse the two because they measure strength by how many people surround them. They look at the crowd and assume the crowd must be right. They see one person standing apart and immediately call that person weak, strange, difficult, or finished. But sometimes standing alone simply means you've stopped borrowing your identity from everyone else. An army gives you numbers. Discipline gives you direction. You don't need 10 people agreeing with every decision you make to know you're moving in the right direction. You don't need constant applause to keep working. You don't need a room full of supporters to remind you that your life has value. If your confidence disappears the moment the crowd leaves, it was never confidence. It was dependence wearing a better outfit. That's why solitude can become powerful. When nobody is cheering, you discover whether you actually believe in what you're doing. When nobody is watching, you discover whether your discipline is real. When nobody is validating you, you discover whether your identity belongs to you or to the people around you, and that can be uncomfortable, because once you stop depending on the crowd, you lose the ability to blame the crowd. You have to make your own decisions. You have to accept your own mistakes. You have to learn from your failures without searching for someone else to carry the responsibility. But somewhere inside that discomfort, something changes. You become independent, not emotionally numb, not disconnected from everyone. Independent. You can love people without needing them to approve every move. You can listen to advice without surrendering your judgment. You can accept criticism without allowing it to define you. You can walk away from people who repeatedly disrespect you without spending your life trying to convince them that they were wrong. That's when standing alone stops feeling like punishment, becomes freedom. The people who once believed you needed their approval begin noticing that their influence is shrinking. They may try to pull you back with guilt. They may remind you of everything they've done for you. They may suddenly become supportive when they realize you're no longer chasing their acceptance. But you can appreciate someone without becoming dependent on them. That's the difference between connection and control. You don't need an army because your greatest battles aren't always fought against other people. Sometimes the real battle is against fear, insecurity, procrastination, anger, and the old version of yourself that keeps asking permission to become something greater. And that battle requires no audience. You fight it when nobody knows you're fighting. You fight it when you choose discipline instead of comfort. You fight it when you keep your word to yourself. You fight it when failure gives you another reason to quit, and you decide to learn instead of to learn instead. People begin calling you strong because they see the results. They don't see the lonely mornings, the difficult decisions, the moments when you questioned everything and still kept moving. They don't understand that the army was never supposed to be outside you. It was being built inside you through every lesson, every failure, every boundary, every discipline choice, until you realized that standing alone was never proof that you had no support. It was proof that you had finally developed enough inner strength to keep moving even when the crowd stopped moving with you.